Today I'm going to talk about HTML5, but kind of in the larger sense. It's not going to just be strictly the HTML5 though standard. We'll be talking about CSS3. We'll be talking about some of the new JavaScript APIs. There'll be a little smidgen of WebGL and SVG, just to kind of throw things in. And the structure of this presentation is there's a lot going on. And I wanted to kind of give a sense of a lot of the different things that are happening. And this slide deck is actually built using HTML5 and CSS3. And a lot of it, there'll be interactive portions in the slide that will show you, in effect, some of these things. And these slides have been created collaboratively by an open source community. So it's been an ongoing open source project to kind of create this educational slide deck. So let's get started. Where did we just come from? So in the 90s, there was sort of a lot of progress on the web. We saw a lot of exciting things. And then the last 10 years, things kind of slowed down for a little bit. Big thing in sort of 2001, 2002 was throwaway tables, use CSS. People embraced that. And then in 2005, Ajax started taking off. The web kind of started coming back to life. The last few years have been kind of the age of JavaScript toolkits. Things like jQuery, Prototype, Dojo, Scriptaculous. Who here uses jQuery, for example? Yeah, that's really taken the world by storm, and people are really using that. And a lot of those were attempts to kind of make the web an easier place to develop for and kind of sort of iron over its issues. And what's really exciting is starting in about 2009, we're starting to really see the browsers themselves catch back up. So the development of HTML5, browsers are actually starting to implement things like SVG. We're seeing new experiments in CSS3 and WebGL, so it's an exciting time. It's a great time to be a web developer. So the next 5 years is going to be very exciting. And like I said, strictly, we're going to be talking about things that are a little larger than just the HTML5 standard. We'll be talking about CSS, which you need to get your job done, especially CSS3, and a lot of these new JavaScript APIs that come along in HTML5, like Geolocation. So let's start with the JavaScript APIs. But one of the things that is coming along is everyone uses sort of getElement by ID and getElements by tag name. But a new method's coming along called getElements by class name. And jQuery, again, really showed how powerful it is when you can use CSS selectors in order to grab things from your page. So now you could add the class name business cards or event and get all of the elements on the page with this new method. But you can go beyond this. A new method is coming along called query selector all. And again, it's sort of like what jQuery gives you. And you can put an arbitrary CSS selector in there. So right here, for example, we're saying, I've got an unordered list. Grab me each of the list items. And then the nth child, just give me the odd ones. So you might imagine using that to make a striping pattern on a table, for example, or in a list. Here we have another one, query selector all. We're saying, give me the table that has the class name test. Then give me its immediate table row. And then its immediate all of the table elements. So that one line will return you back a lot of things that in the old style of having to use the document object model would have taken a lot of code. So another cool thing coming along is something called web storage. And let me show you the demo first. So in this form is being tied into local storage. It's storing little bits of data in your browser. If we restart, you saw that it stayed there. And if I restarted the browser or the browser crashed, it would still be there. So the first thing you get is you get a new thing called local storage, window.local storage. So right here we say, add an event listener when you've taken your hands off the keyboard in the text area. The local storage object is just like a hash table. You put key value pairs into it. So there we are. We use value and we set it to the value of the text area. And on the next line, local storage timestamp, there we are giving a timestamp. So it's really easy to use and it just persists. And getting the value is just as straightforward. Window.local storage, give me my value. Now, when simple key value pairs isn't enough, another part of HTML5 is a real SQL database. Now, Gears had this, and it was really fun. Offline Gmail, for example, uses the SQL storage inside of Gears. And the HTML5 SQL storage is very similar. It was inspired by it. And once you have a real SQL engine on the client side, you can do all sorts of interesting things, like sorting on a complex table that has a lot of data, or searching along different things. Let's look at the demo first. This is like a simple little to-do list. Throw me some to-do lists, like some items, like, shave yaks. Learn HTML5. Anyone else have a task? Doesn't have to make any sense.
More pizza.
More pizza. Good one. One more. More chairs. More beer. We'll have that one too. So the cool thing is, in Safari and in Chrome, you can actually go into a new view where you can actually see all of what's stored. And you can actually give SQL expressions against what's in your data, which is really powerful. And here is some code that shows how to use this. The first thing you do is you open your database, and you give your database a name, and you give it a version. Why do you think you want to version these client-side databases? Synchronization. And migration. People may go out of date. So you might want to push some JavaScript that would update a schema, for example. When you open your database, the next thing you want to do is you want to do everything inside of a transaction. And HTML5 has you do all your calls to the database inside of a transaction because the web is a very unforgiving environment. And it wants to make sure that all your calls went through or they didn't in a solid way. Browsers crash, users leave the page. So the first thing you do is you say, give me a transaction, TX. And once you have that, you can execute your SQL. And there we are executing some SQL there. Select star from our test table. And then you can provide arguments, which we don't have. And actually, your results come back in another callback, a success callback and an error callback. Why do you think you would want to have your results come back asynchronously? What's that? Exactly. So it's non-blocking. What if you're querying a monstrous SQL table? The browser will freeze. So that doesn't happen, all results come back asynchronously, so it won't end up blocking the browser. So these different kinds of storage go hand in hand with an application cache, so you can take your browsers offline. To use these, the first thing is you add a new attribute to your HTML tag, manifest equals. And then you give it a file name. And in that file name, you provide a pointer to a file, and we have an example file right down here. The first line of this file, you always say the word cache manifest. Another important thing is this file needs to be served up with a special MIME type. So you have to configure your server. If you're running into weird stuff, that's an important little thing to look for. You can give all sorts of options in here. We're going to keep it simple. You can say what you want to cache. We say cache : and then we provide a list of resources. So we're grabbing some ping files, some JavaScript, some CSS. You can actually give other kinds of things. You can kind of give white lists of things that you don't want to cache. Maybe when you're online, you hit a server-side PHP script, but you obviously want to do something else when you're offline. Two important things. One is that the way that the browser works with this is the browser grabs the cache manifest file, and it sees if the file itself ever changed. If the file itself is changed, it goes and downloads each of the files inside of it. And it only succeeds if every single file successfully is downloaded, so that you're not in a weird in-between state, right? So you don't have half of what you need offline. So it's all works or all fails. So one thing to note is that the browser doesn't check to see whether the individual files have changed. It only looks if the manifest file has changed. So as a trick, if you want to version your resources, you can just give a comment like version 1, and as soon as you change that to like version 2, the file signature will change, and the browser goes, oh, okay, I need to download more resources. There's a whole slew of events that you can subscribe to in order to give a nice user interface. So you see up there, add event listener, checking, so that you could provide some UI. And there's a whole bunch of these events that you can subscribe to. Web workers. Web workers allow you to run code that won't block the browser. They're not threads, but they kind of act like them. Let me show you a demo first. So right here we have sort of Google Maps. And let's say we want to find routes between a bunch of different cities, something that's really computationally intensive. If we don't use workers and we try to drag, notice how it froze up there? I'm running my mouse, doesn't do anything. Bad user experience. If we use workers, while it's thinking, the browser can stay responsive. So why would you want that? Well, there are demos showing workers doing real-time image analysis of video in order to do sort of tracking, real-time OCR, all sorts of interesting things moving to the client side to take advantage of these machines. And let's look at some code using these. The first thing is you get a new object called worker. So you say new worker, and you put the JavaScript that you want to run inside that worker in another file. So we say extrawork.js. And workers communicate back with the page that called them by using messaging. Right? So you send it a message, it sends you back a message. By the way, that's one of the patterns. If you look through HTML5 and a lot of the JavaScript APIs, they choose asynchronous type calling most of the time, and they choose kind of a message style most of the time, if you're looking for a common pattern. So once we make our worker, in order to get results back, we say worker.onMessage. You give it a function that will get called, and there we are. We say alert event.data. That would be the data that the worker has sent me. Right? You could imagine the workers calculating prime numbers, for example. Inside of the extrawork.js file, you can imagine we're doing some work. You have a new magic method called postMessage. And you can post message with some data. It can be arbitrary JavaScript, so JavaScript can get sent back and forth like JSON. I want to briefly talk about notifications. This is actually not formally a part of HTML5. It's an experimental part of Chrome. It's one of the things being proposed. And it allows you to do little pop-up style toast messages. So first you have to give a site permission. We don't want sites being all annoying, so we're allowing. And yeah, there we go. So we have a nice little notification that appeared. To use these, again, let's look at some sample code. The first thing, you get a new object called window.webkit_notifications. You want to make sure that object is there. And you call check permission. And check permission will return 0 if it's been allowed permission. It's actually a constant, if the user has allowed before. If they have, we create a notification. We say webkit notifications.create notification. And you'll see up here we can pass a picture in. So we pass a URL to an image. We can pass a title in. We can pass text and so on. You can get pretty fancy. And then finally, if the user's never given it, we say webkit notifications.request permission. And that will do that little gold bar you saw at the top, asking, hey, can the site do these? Are there any quick questions before we continue? So the question is, what happened to the method getElementsByName? Most people didn't know about this. There's an older method where you can enumerate things by name. It's an older method. This predated even having IDs on elements. It doesn't always work consistently across everything on a page. It's essentially deprecated. So it's dangerous to use unless you really know what you're doing. Maybe you're a weird JavaScript hacker.
How do we get collections for radio buttons and checkboxes?
So you would give a query. How do you get collections for radio boxes and checkboxes? One of the things you'll see when I get into CSS3 is you can get pretty fancy with your CSS selectors. So you could say, give me all the inputs that are checked. And so you would pass that into query selector all to get all the checked radio buttons. So let's move on, unfortunately, because we have a fair amount of material left. One of the things about HTML5 is drag and drop. And again, we could spend a whole talk just talking about drag and drop. There's a lot of stuff in here. But just to show you some sample code and then some demos, the first thing you do is you say document.addEventListener and you subscribe to the drag start event. Tell me when dragging has started. Inside of there, you get an event object with a special data transfer member. So you can say event.datatransfer.setData. So you could override the data that's actually being, you could clean it up. You could do some special things to it. And then you can actually do what's called an effect. So you could say, actually copy the data rather than have a reference. Or actually kind of control how things are shown to the user. And there's a lot of different options, a lot of configuration. It's a little bit of a hard API to use, unfortunately, but it's fairly powerful. As an example, I'm dragging this image. If I drop it into the drop area, over here you see what some code would get. You can get your results in essentially different kinds of flavors. So here we are grabbing a URI list, and then here we are grabbing a URL, which is just the reference to the image. Here I am selecting some text, and I'm dragging that over here. And in this, we're making the original text. So it's actually exactly the same text that was dragged. But you could get fancy. Let's say I grab this text and drag it. What has been drag and dropped is different. So we've added some HTML into it. I don't know if people can see that. So it says strong overwritten content in strong. So basically, you can kind of hook in at different levels and do some very powerful things. The last of our JavaScript APIs for now is Geolocation. This is one of my favorite ones because I find it really easy to use. And I think that it opens up something that you couldn't do on the web before. Let's start with the demo. So we have a Google map, and it dropped the little location here showing us on Market Street. To do that, the first thing is you look for the navigator.geolocation object. If it's there, there's a great method, it's a simple method, get current position, which you give it a callback, and you get back a position object, and it's really straightforward. Once you have that, you can grab the latitude and the longitude, and you could pass those two numbers into an API for maps, because those generally take those as an input. You could pass that into a social networking app. You could do all sorts of interesting things. One thing to mention is the first time you do this, the browser will prompt the user saying, hey, this site wants to know your position. Do you give them permission? Because obviously, again, we want the user to be in control of this. So the question is the fact that you're being asked for geolocation data built into the browser? Yes, that's totally built into the browser. And actually, the iPhone will prompt you if a website uses it. Chrome or Firefox will prompt you as well, because we don't want sites being able to know your location without your permission. So that rounds out the JavaScript APIs. Obviously, a lot of really cool new things. Being able to build a desktop experience with things like notifications, drag and drop. Client-side storage lets you actually get better performance by actually using these computers. I like to say the old web treated our machines like they were Commodore 64s. We've got these amazing machines now with so much storage and power. And HTML5 really uses the CPU on these machines with things like workers. Really uses the hard drives on these things. I mean, we have hundreds of gigabytes, and the web has not been able to use these with a user's permission. So really expanding what the client side can do. Let's look at some of the new tags that come along. It's like Christmas time. There's all these nice new tags. Again, I'm just going to briefly touch on them. But you get some new semantic tags. One of them is a header that just says, hey, this is a header at the top of my page. H-group lets you have different little portions of that header. You've got nav, which is what it sounds like. It says, hey, this is a navigation section. We've got a section element, which just says, when you look at a page, you can say, hey, these are different sections, right? So now you can tell the browser, hey, this is the section where my ads are. This is the section where my articles are, and so on. There's an article tag. And then inside of these, you can actually group these. So an article could itself have a header and a footer. A side is actually for things that are not part of the normal flow. So if you've ever read an article and you've seen like a little blowout, right, with a quote, that would be an aside. Or maybe you're reading an article on Scientific American and there's an infographic. That would be an aside. What's nice about these don't give you necessarily anything that you couldn't do by setting a CSS class name. But the nice thing is it keeps your markup, it's more semantic. It helps search engines. If you want your page to be screen scraped, especially when we get to microdata, which I'll talk about, you are helping other machines understand your page in a better way. And you're also making your page more maintainable. One of the things in HTML5, one of the big philosophies is to codify what people are already doing. One of the ideas is called, pave the cow paths. There's a famous story of a college. They didn't know where they wanted to make the paths, so they made everything grass, and they saw where the grass was was sort of lower because everyone walked there, and then that's where they made the sidewalks. That's especially true with things like these link relations. these have all existed. HTML5 just says, hey, it's okay to use them. You don't have to feel guilty about using them. So I'm not going to explain them all, but like rel equals icon gives you a little fave icon, over in the browser bar. Pingback is interesting. Pingback, a page can say, here's a URL. If another page links to me, whether it's a comment, ping this URL and tell me. And then that page can maintain all of the links that point in. WordPress, for example, does this. Prefetch, I think Firefox innovated this one. Prefetch tells the browser, hey, it might be a really good idea to grab this page or these collection of pages because it'll improve the user performance because they'll probably click on them. So on, things like archives, points to archives, and so on. Microdata. I'm really excited about this one. Microdata gives you a way to sprinkle a little bit of extra information into your page, or metadata, to help, again, search engines, third-party tools. And the thing I love about it is it doesn't try to boil the ocean. It's not trying to be, artificial intelligence markup language. And it's learning from a lot of the lessons of the last 15 years from things like microformats, which showed, hey, you want to mix your data into your HTML because people are actually going to do things there. You want to keep it simple. It learned some of the lessons of RDF, of a little bit of a sophisticated model, but it doesn't go overboard. First off, I'll give the benefit. Right now, Google will actually see some microdata markups for like events, reviews, in order to give better search results. So down here, there's a rich snippets testing tool. We're giving like a URL to, let's say, like a pizza shop. And down here, you see a result where it knows, for example, the name of the pizza place, the location. It has ratings because there was some microdata that said, hey, here's how many stars it was given, and so on. Let's quickly look at an example microdata. The first thing that you should know is, again, you mix this into your HTML. Let's say we have an event. You would mix it into the HTML. And generally, it should be things that are visible to the user, like a review, or in this case, information about a band. The first thing you do is you say item type. And you give a URL that's arbitrary that just says, that points to it doesn't actually point to anything. It can, but it can be, anything that starts with this item type will be a band, or will be an event, or will be a resume. And then you give item scope. So you say, this is where my band information starts. This is where my event information starts. And then you give each of the item properties. So there we say item prop equals name. So we're giving the name of one of the members of the band, Neil. We're giving item prop equals band. The name is 4 Parts Water. And then we're giving the nationality, for example, of the band, which is British. So really straightforward. And there's already a number of these sort of very simple markups that you can annotate your pages with. So Aria is actually, again, not necessarily part of HTML5, but it's something that's finally arriving. How many of you use like jQuery UI or Dojo UI? Right? You might use these JavaScript widgets that give you a tree or give you sort of like a data control, things like that. One problem with those is screen readers can't work with them. So Aria, which I'm really impressed by, is a way to kind of overlay a little bit of extra information so that screen readers know that that jQuery UI component that was a tree is a tree. Right? And most of these widgets produce HTML, so they just annotate the HTML that they produce, which the screen readers can see, which accessibility tools can see. So here's an example. Here's, let's say, some of the HTML of a tree. We have an unordered list, and we say role equals tree. So we're saying, hey, this unordered list, it's not an unordered list. It's actually a tree control. And then we can give a special thing, aria-labeled by, which gives a nice label to maybe present or say or show magnified so that a user can know what it is. And then on each of the little list items, we give the role. So we're saying that first list item, that's actually a tree item. And we're saying aria-expanded equals true. So you could imagine that if your JavaScript widget says aria-expanded equals false, the screen reader will know that and be able to interact with it. And then here we have a group. So we say role equals group. We give more tree items. So it's a pretty straightforward standard. It gives you a lot of bang for the buck. Again, but the basic idea is you give the role of things, and you kind of say what things are a little bit to help these screen readers. Another part of HTML, which is just arriving, which I think is going to really make an impact, is these new form field types. So right here, for example, here's a range. We didn't have to make that with JavaScript. We just have a new input type. Type equals range. We gave the minimum, the maximum, and the default. And the browser gave it to us. There's a nice new attribute on input controls called autofocus, which just says, hey, when the page loads, give that field autofocus. Probably like 90% of the JavaScript out there is to do that. So a lot of HTML5 is, again, pave the cow paths. Get things out of JavaScript that don't really belong there. Get them back in the browser so we can have a more reliable web and continue moving forward. Another simple one. We have a new attribute called placeholder. So here we have input type equals text, a text field, and placeholder will give you some nice, fancy little grayed out text. When I go inside, little things. But things like this, if you're a web developer, is a pain in the butt to have to do yourself. And now you get an attribute to do it. Like I said, there's all sorts of other cool input controls that are not widely implemented yet. Opera gets a gold star. They actually implement most of them, I think. Things like menu for a menu, progress bar, so you can show progress, times, and so on. Those are going to be nice as they start showing up. So I think HTML5 video has gotten a lot of press lately. Let's start with audio. Let me show you the demos first. Start with the French national anthem. You proof? And of course, this control right here is all given by the browser. And JavaScript can interact with it. Audio is pretty simple. We see an audio tag. Controls just says, hey, let the browser give me controls. You could not do that and do your own custom funky controls if you want to. And of course, we get a JavaScript API. So there we are. We grab the audio tag, and we set .muted equals false, which mutes it. Again, there's a whole bunch of options here. You can nest multiple content types and so on. Let's look at video. So again, when I hover over, the browser gives me a control. And this is really a part of the browser. So we're adding CSS reflection. That's one of the interesting things. It gets these out of a black box. And you can actually start applying. Think of that's what's so cool about HTML5. They're like little tools, like many little pieces that you can hook together in interesting ways. You can style SVG with CSS3. So you can do vector graphics that uses cascading style sheets. You can add animations on top of HTML5 video. So there's these cool interlocking pieces that get us outside of a little box on the page. And again, very similar to the audio tag. We have a video tag. We can say autoplay, which means, hey, start this when the page is loaded. Controls, we'll give you those controls. And we have simple methods like play. And again, for both of these, there's a whole slew of events you can listen to know where, is it buffering, is it done, if you want those hooks to give a nice interface to your users. So Canvas is like an easy way to draw on the page. It gives you a really straightforward JavaScript API. Right down there is actually the result of the code that you see up there. The first thing you have is you have a canvas tag. You give it an ID. Think of it like a little paintable area. Give it a width and height. And then inside your JavaScript, you grab a reference to the canvas. You say get context 2D, and I'll show you the hooks. That opens up having a 3D context, which we'll see with WebGL. And then once you have that, you make calls on it. So there we are. We make a fill rectangle. There's our black rectangle. We begin a path. We make an arc. We set a width. We make the ends rounded. We set the stroke style. And I'll be talking about this. You may have seen RGB. But one of the new things is RGBA, which just allows you to give opacity on colors. So you can do nice effects with that. And then finally, we say .stroke to actually draw the thing. Here is a canvas example. You can interact with things. Canvas is the way people always ask me, how should I think of Canvas and SVG? Canvas is really good essentially at sort of bitmap operations. If you want to make something that's like Photoshop, then you would be using Canvas because they're pixels. So look, I just exported this to JPEG, which is one of the things that you can do with Canvas. I exported this to PNG, what you see here. SVG is vectors. If you were doing something like Illustrator, which is type illustration, that's when you would use that technology. So pixels or vectors. And they both have different uses in your toolkit. One of the cool things in HTML5 is it says that you can now natively use SVG. People ask, what is SVG? SVG, just like HTML gives you a bunch of tags like form and table, SVG just gives you a bunch of extra new tags like circle, rectangle, that you can mix in. And HTML5 says you can now drop these tags into normal HTML. If people had followed this in the past, you had to use something called XHTML. You had to jump through some hoops. So it kind of streamlines SVG a little bit. Here we are in some HTML. We just say this is SVG. And I'm doing a couple different things in this circle. The nice thing about this is it's just like HTML. We can give them IDs. We can give them classes. So we could have common styles. Here I am putting the center of the circle right here, 50% of the way in the page, and then down 25%. I'm putting a radius. One of the cool things is you can do gradient fills. So here I am referencing a fill that I've defined, which is not on the page here. And then, again, you can use all your JavaScript skills. So on mouse down, it says hello. Here's a nice SVG example that shows. Here we have the tiger, classic illustrated tiger. And as we zoom in, things still say nice. Canvas 3D or WebGL. Now this is still kind of being baked, but it's a very exciting thing. What you're seeing down there is being rendered right now. That's not a movie. Those are 3D graphics being drawn by JavaScript. And WebGL looks and feels like the standard HTML5 canvas. You have a canvas tag up there. You get it. But you do something magical. You say get context. And for now, you say experimental-WebGL. And that hands you back an object that is essentially OpenGL with a JavaScript wrapper. And there we are making a viewport, which just says, where in the 3D space? You know, kind of, where's my sizing? Now, these things all start coming together. With workers and faster JavaScript in web browsers, you can imagine doing lots of scene graph detection and powerful things on a worker, not to block the browser, passing messages back over that's drawing to a WebGL context, that's maybe showing like cool little readouts on your game with Canvas, that might be bringing in graphical resources as SVG. So again, remember, think about these many pieces that work together. So the final thing is CSS3. One of the first things that CSS3 brings you are more of these selectors. So what are these selectors? CSS binds onto the thing on your page using selectors. And CSS3 gives you more of them based on what people have asked for. The first one, we say .row, nth child, even, will give me the even version of a list. And then you can do the odd. And why would you want to do that? Well, it used to be so hard to have a list of data, and to make something more readable, you generally want to make it, every other color, right? So the eye can follow it, like that little row there. That was really hard to do. You had to do like server-side processing to write out different classes. Now you can do it with just a little bit of CSS. Something called inline-block. This one's hard to describe, but it's really cool. How many of you have ever tried to use CSS trying to replace tables, and you want like some images to go right next to each other? You want them to line up, and when the width of the page changes, you want it to kind of go down. Basically something that you really need to kind of replace tables. Inline block kind of gives you a midway between a block level element and an inline level element. Kind of gives you qualities of both. And I encourage you to take a look more at it. We don't have time to go deep into it, but it's one of these CSS properties that allows you to do tasks that really used to require tables in a straightforward way. And you'll see that when we get to columns, by the way, as well. Someone had asked about specific attributes. Well, now you can actually match input type equals text, for example. So you can actually match on attributes. Well, you could imagine putting this with microdata, saying this is an event, or some of these new semantic tags. So you might say article, bracket, item type, or sort of item prop equals importance. You could start working at a higher level in your CSS. And that's where those attributes start coming in. Negation, this is interesting. You get a colon not. So we're saying colon not if something has the class name box. Or we're saying if something is not a span. So you can kind of do an inverse. And finally, we can do more specific targeting. We get like dash colon first child, which would get, let's say we've got a header element. And let's say we've got a nice image as the first thing. Well, that will grab us the first child. And then we can do fancy stuff on it. And then other ones, most people have seen the bracket. The plus is adjacency. So it says, if I have an H2 element right next to a header element, then do this. So these selectors might seem kind of dry, but they allow you to do a lot of common tasks and grab things on your page. One of the cool things, this is actually CSS 2.1, but it's finally arriving. It's taken like 10, 15 years for web fonts to arrive, and they're finally arriving. To use them, you say @font face. You give your font a name, like we have font-family League Gothic. And then you point it to a font file. There's a lot of different discussion about which font files. Personally, I believe that OpenType has sort of arrived as the de facto thing that folks can use. But other browsers have other standards which you can kind of patch over. But there we are grabbing leaguegothic.otf. And then you can use it like any other font. So we say header font-family League Gothic. And here's a little font down here. And it's not an image. So you can treat it as real text. I can print it. A search engine can work with it better. If I change the size of the browser, if I zoom in because I need accessibility, it still stays a font. Here's another one of those nice little things that you don't know you want it until you need it. Something called ellipses. If I've got a bunch of text and it doesn't know how to squeeze in the page, I want to be able to add 3 little dots if the size changes. You have no idea how much pain people have gone through having to do server-side solutions to calculate these things. Now you get a nice text-overflow ellipses. We see up here it doesn't have it, but right here it does. So as we change the width, you see those 3 little dots? It gives you ellipses. You'll see this with the border, like the rounded corners too, what people used to have to go through for these things. Here we are with columns. Again, something that used to be a pain in the butt to do. We say, give me 2 columns. Here we're making the little rule, and we put a gap. And here we are changing the number of columns. People understand, yeah. So to do this in the past, you had to make like weird wrappers and do funky stuff in your markup and like do negative margins. And we like, a lot of us in the community, we say that you shouldn't have to be a wizard with HTML or JavaScript or CSS to do things that everyone needs to do. So a lot of this stuff is about you don't have to be a wizard. You can just get your job done. Text stroke, this is pretty simple. Here I am changing the width. You have more control now over stroking. So here we are saying fill this with black, make the stroke, which is the outside red, and then change the width. I talked about RGBA. It's a little letter, but it makes a big difference. In the past, you could just give red, green, blue. Now you can give a 4th channel, which is opacity, letting you do some nice effects. So here we have red, green, blue, and then the opacity. So we're saying 75%. And if I change that, there's the text, and then my background has one of these 2. This used to require you'd have to like custom make images for every single permutation and push them down to the client. Now you can just, again, this could be a web font. There could be SVG in here. These things go together. So now you can use the client like it's more than a Commodore 64. This is kind of subtle. There's a whole other color model called hue, saturation, luminance, HSL. And the reason it matters is humans don't think of colors in terms of how RGB asks you to think of colors. Artists, graphic designers think of colors in terms of hue, which is like the color of something, saturation, which is like how gray it is, luminance, which is how bright it is. So this allows graphic designers and so on to make colors the way that people more naturally think about colors. So here we are changing these different things. This is one of the things showing up. in more browsers. Then, of course, we have the opacity. Rounded corners. I know, I love it. It's great. It used to be a pain in the butt to make rounded corners. It's amazing how just the common things used to be so hard. We now have a border dash radius, and you look at the outside, changes it. Gradients. Again, this could be a deep subject. I'm not going to go into all of them. But CSS3 gives you gradients. We have linear gradient at the top. We just say start at the top, go down to the bottom, and then we give stops. So you can give multiple stops. There we are going between two different colors. And we have radial gradients, which obviously gives you a radial. And you give like an arc, and you give a radius. And here we are just changing that. And again, you could have an opacity channel, so this could be on top of something. With great power comes great responsibility, by the way. Shadows, again, text shadows. There we are controlling the horizontal, the vertical, the offset. Unfortunately, box shadow is not working right now, so I can't show you that one. So I love this one, Instant Web 2.0. So here's our logo. We add a text shadow first, and then we add a linear gradient, and then we put some little roundies on the sides, and then we add the reflection. Simple things around CSS3 gives you background enhancements. So it used to be you didn't have a lot of control if you made a background image. Now you have a new background dash size. So you can say always make sure if something's in a box, it contains it. You can say it's okay if you clip the corners of me, or always clip the corners of me. And then you can say always, scale me 100%. So just more control, and you can now have multiple backgrounds. Again, so you don't have to spend all your time in Photoshop. Here we have here we have two backgrounds, a little toggle here and some nice little. So transitions. Again, a deep subject. We could spend a lot of time talking about these, but you now have these CSS3 animations. So here we have, here's the old school, left and right. We're just changing the class name of this little box. Nothing quite happens. But now we've got a WebKit transition where we're saying change the margin over 1 second, ease in, and then ease out. And you'll see what I mean. So we say, ooh. See how kind of accelerated then stopped? So ease in, ease out, and it's changing the margin. And it's going against this. We change the margin left, right here. So we're saying go to what its definition should be over 1 second. So really simple, straightforward animation. Transitions, these can go together. Here we have using a :hover, which is a great pseudo class, which can replace a lot of JavaScript, where you just say, when I'm hovered over, apply this rule. And here we are applying this simple transform to rotate and scale. And there's also 3D. So we can actually rotate across the z-axis. Doing fancy. That would allow you to do kind of iTunes style, sort of shuffle type things. CSS animations, again, it could be a deep subject, but from a high level, you define your keyframes. So you say, this should be here, and then this should be here. And then you can define new animations over a certain amount of time, and we're getting this. So you could remake the blink tag if you want. So where are these things supported? That can be a complicated subject because it's really fast changing these days. Firefox 3, 3.5, 3.6, Chrome, IE8 actually has a number of HTML5 things in it. IE9, congrats to them, has a lot of really cool stuff in it. New versions of Chrome are always kind of being pushed to you that have new things implemented. One just got sent pretty recently, Safari. So a lot of these things can be used today. I'll briefly mention Chrome Frame. One of the things that's interesting about it is this page itself could be viewed in IE6, 7, and 8 if Chrome Frame is present, and you just drop a simple meta tag. And I don't have my virtual machine set up, fortunately, but this whole presentation would run exactly as you see it inside of Internet Explorer. So that can be a good sort of temporary way to help you deploy what you're doing. So we have time for a few questions, just about 5 minutes, is that right? So the question is, are there any limits on workers? And are we seeing, basically, how are we seeing people use? Oh, distributed workers. So the first question, to be honest, I'm not completely sure. I know that Gears used to have a 256 worker limit. I'm not sure what the browsers themselves are doing. By the way, a lot of parts of HTML5 sort of Gears sort of got refactored in. So workers was one of those. The second question is, I've always thought it'd be really cool, if someone had a bit of JavaScript that they, have a distributed network, SETI at home using workers. It'd be kind of crazy. Yes. So the question is, can you inject ads into an HTML5 video like you can do with Flash? I'm not. So HTML5 video gives you a number of events. So you could imagine reusing a video surface to queue up and have control and have a number of video resources that you've queued up that you're just like you dynamically change the source of an image. You could say, you get timeline events. So I could say 5 seconds in, or at the very beginning, say the source equals my ad. And then when that's done, you say the source equals, the content. That would be one way to do it. So yes, you can do it. Yeah, but not with ActionScript. What about development tools? That's a great question. Someone could make a lot of money making great development tools for this stuff. Go do it now before someone else does it. Hopefully Adobe will, because they make great tools. They make great tools. I actually work with Flash a lot as well, and the tools are amazing. So I'd love to see. Yeah. So the question is, I mentioned 2 features that ask for permission: geolocation and notifications. And what other features use these? And is there a common way that they ask? Yeah, other things do ask. Offline will ask. Local storage, SQL storage will ask. I might be missing some others. They all tend to do the butter bar approach, which is you get a little butter bar at the top. Browsers can choose to determine how they want to ask you, but most, I believe, have been doing the butter bar approach. Like since IE8, they've been doing a similar butter bar approach. So that's the level of consistency. So the question is, do you have the ability to style the browser's native or default controls? I don't believe that there's anything in the spec that says that you can do that. And I don't believe any browsers necessarily expose that. I could be wrong if someone knows about that. I think it's an all or nothing type of situation. So if you would just leave the controls tag off, and again, you could imagine just say on mouse hover, then you could use these different things, use that art, the opacity now. Use a little CSS3 animation, say, show a div, position it. You can relative or absolute over the video or down. So you could just have to recreate it yourself. But again, you use these pieces together. That's why, again, I like to say, if a browser just chooses to implement HTML5 video, the stuff goes together. And then your buttons, for example, would be little SVG resources, so they look good on a giant media screen or on a small, so that they're resolution independent. And so the question is, for tags like the slider tag, which have no representation in older browsers, how do you handle degradation? So degradation can be done in a variety of ways. Most browsers will keep those custom tags in the markup. And there are tricks for IE to force it to see unknown tags. And then you could do capabilities detection and then shim in some JavaScript. I'm doing crazy shimming for SVG and SVG Web, where if the browser natively supports SVG, it's beautiful. But if it's not, I'm doing crazy JavaScript tricks. I'm shimming in Flash. So it depends on what you're trying to do with an emulation layer that brings it in and stuff. So you'd have to shim. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate it.